Mainly, I thought I'd just tell some stories. Is the mic working adequately back there? Okay. And the Nobel Prize for Literature was just given to Bob Dylan. That just drives me silly, happy silly, you know. And in talking about the Nobel Prize, back about 2012, I emceed a program in Livingston, Montana. It was a night with Jim Harrison and Peter Matheson. And, you know, if you were an osprey in a tree on the Yellowstone River, you might possibly see Jim Harrison and Peter Matheson float by in a drift boat, fly fishing for trout, but never on the same stage ever. And that was Livingston's greatest literary night. And Jim, with his great generosity, he was sicker than shit, and he crawled up on that stage and read anyway. His wife, Linda, was in a coma in a hospital. And and Peter Matheson, man who married me, and who was a very close friend ever since Ed Abbey died. Peter and I, Ed Abbey and I met Peter Matheson at the same time in Tucson, I don't know, 30 years ago, a long time ago. And I keep thinking, you know, because that night I said, you know, if any American is going to get the Nobel Prize for Literature, it should be Peter Matheson. And now, and Jim Harrison, had he lived long enough, would be in that category too. And in 1 year, we've lost these incredible writers with immortality in them. And you know, that's a one critic review word that I really value, is they did have immortality in them. They wrote classics, and you know, they happened to be my friends. And over the past 40 years, I've had the great fortune of having been friends with older men who were also writers, and just, you know, specifically that's Ed Abbey. Ed Abbey and I had a long, close, difficult friendship. Once I got to know Peter, we took trips together. Ed died on us, and so Peter Matheson and I decided we would write the book that Ed was going to write on Baja California. Peter would write a long introduction, I'd write the text, and we took great trips. And right after Ed Abbey died, Peter Matheson said, well, Douglas, you know, we should go up to the Grizzly Hilton while I can still get there. You know, he's only in his 60s then, and the guy was trooping into his 80s. But we did. We went up there. It was an incredible time. I'll tell the story a little later if I have time. But, you know, we saw 16 grizzly bears. The only time I've ever been drunk in the backcountry with grizzly bears is when Peter Matheson and I went up there. That's another story. And finally, Jim. Jim died back in March. And Peter died the year before on my birthday, on April 5th. I happened to be at Yale at the time Peter died. And, you know, for me, those are great holes in the sky. I thought to start out with here, I'd just read a brief piece that I wrote on the memorial of Jim's dying. I really didn't, I wanted to choose my words really carefully because this really wasn't about me. It was just about Jim and what a delicate, beautiful friendship that was. Excuse me. I wrote this back, I think in early April. And yeah, okay. This is, somebody else gave it the title. It's called Jim Harrison and the Art of Friendship. A month ago, I drove a half-cooked leg of lamb around the foot of the Santa Rita Mountains to Jim Harrison's place on Sonoyta Creek in southeastern Arizona. The lamb was half-cooked because I planned to finish it off in Jim's oven while our dogs played. Jim lived on one of southern Arizona's last permanent streams, a ribbon of rich habitat known for its giant cottonwoods, native fishes, and a vast array of birds and butterflies. It's a place buzzing with life. We drank wine out back while our dogs played. They splashed in the creek, backlit in the winter sunlight. I hold on to that image now. Jim, America's greatest living writer, died there last Saturday afternoon. The Harrison place is a functional one-story ranch house perched just above the high water level of the creek. It's a little more than a casita. Just west of the small town of Patagonia, the house is isolated, though there's a country road that crosses the creek and about 100 yards upstream. It has a low stone wall and even abandoned tennis courts. Some of my own history unfolded there. My two children fondly remember mini barbecues, often featuring the doves and quail we hunted nearby. Jim and I would grill doves next to the stand of chorizo that blocked off his house from the sight of hordes of frenzied bird watchers who, during the 90s, gathered on the road to watch the rare Mexican blue mockingbird that had chosen to live at Harrison's house. Occasionally, Jim had to fire his .22 Magnum, the snake gun that he used to train his bird dogs, in the air to thin out the crowds. You'd look out there and, there'd be like 50 of the big giant lenses and telescopes just looking right at you, So Jim would go out there and he'd go, "Douglas, watch this," blam! And they'd scatter like pigs before the gun. It was really quite spectacular. When the Harrisons traveled, they trusted me to move in for a week or two and take care of their beloved English setters, Tess and Rose. I was allowed into the wine cellar, but rationed to 1 bottle of Domaine Bandol per day. I hunted each morning with the dogs, and they revealed to me a hidden doggy universe. I met Jim Harrison in northern Michigan in 1981, the same year my daughter was born. Actually, Jim and I corresponded from the very beginning. Jim wrote Wolf, and Jim was a man from northern Michigan that liked women, wine, and woods, and Bill Eastlake thought maybe I had secretly written that book, which of course is not true, but he gave me the galley of that book, and so I knew Jim from the beginning, and we corresponded for about 5 years before I went up to northern Michigan, where I'd built a house for my parents on an inland lake just in the very tip of the lower peninsula. And anyway, I'll just read this. So I met Jim in 1981. I called him up from my parents' place up on Thumb Lake, and he said, "Come on over." Russell Chatham and Guy de la Valdine were there, and all 3 guys cooked separate, elaborate entrees. You can't believe the cooking that went on. Guy was cooking this duck, and he deboned the duck by pulling all the bones out from the duck's bumhole. That's loving cooking. Okay. Anyway, fresh from hanging out with grizzly bears in the northern Rockies, I wasn't used to such laborious and spirited cuisine. By the time I staggered out the door, Harrison had tucked a bottle of 1971 Lafite under my arm. Not a bad way to treat a stranger. Between then and the time he bought his little house on Sonoyta Creek, Harrison and I took a number of camping trips, mostly in the Southwest, as Jim had little interest in meeting a grizzly bear. This was in the 80s. We visited the Cabeza Prieta, where we camped in one of Ed Abbey's 2 favorite camps in Daniels Wash, just on the edge of Charlie Bell Pass. We camped in the Baba Kivris. I had a place there. It's a Hohokam site where there's petroglyphs all over the place. It's a wonderful place. And I remember going out there on the east side of the Baba Kivris there. It's now pretty much a migrant route, and it's not as pleasant a place as it used to be. But Jim was worried because we went out there with, I forget if we had 3 or 4 bottles of Bordeaux, and it looked like we were going to run out. And he wondered if I could go back to Three Forks, a place where the Indians bought their liquor, you don't exactly have Bordeaux at such a place. But anyway, we got through the night. It was all right. Okay. I took him down to the Seri coast of Sonora, Mexico. And the place, Jim and I went through the border, and I can remember, in all the checkpoints, like the Border Patrol, they want to know, they're checking you out, and I always look a little suspicious, and I'm a little, naturally paranoid, and I have, the cornered ferret aspect to my charming personality sneaks out during border checks. And, so Jim was all, and they said, "Where are you from?" And Jim in his accent said, "Michigan." And that was it. They just waved us through. It was the easiest trip I ever had down there. Anyway, we were down there, and we're in a great place. It's south of Caborca, which is a dope town now, but back in those days, it's also a place where It's the only place in the North American continent where ancient Pleistocene hunters, the Clovis people, hunted a gompha there. And that is like a elephant-like thing with actually four horns kind of coming out of it. And we didn't know it was there then, but that's where we camped, and it was into an empty land where we could stand up on a mesa and see the ocean out there. And it's a series of cliffs going down, and you start down the cliffs, and you see piles of snail shells. And that's where, the prehistoric Indians trekked inland with a pile of snail shells and had a little sushi on one of those ledges. So anyway, Jim and I are out there, and I actually got a huge backpack on Jim on this wild mesa overlooking the Sea of Cortez. The only time, in my knowledge, he ever put one on. I had to hook the waist strap under his considerable belly because he couldn't see it, And his pack was so heavy with beer and a big bottle of tequila, we had to board our hike. We had to come back, and remember, we had to camp close to the truck, and there was a desert tortoise shell there. We called it Turtle Camp. So more camping stories. In the Boot Hill of New Mexico, up in the empty Animas Mountains, we perhaps set a world record for cold cooking puttanesco over an oak fire. I wore fingerless gloves chopping the garlic while the olive oil congealed on the outside of the frying pan. We sat around the blazing fire digesting Italian sausage we overate almost every time we cooked in the woods. And we spent the night watching tiny elf owls. It was like probably April because it's the mating season for these little elf owls. And Jim and I were just there. We just had a sloth and bloat, and we were enjoying an Armagnac after a big meal. And all of a sudden, we looked up, and there's all these, up in 20 or 30 elf owls looking at us, and they'd flit from one perch to the other, and they vocalized during that time, which is their mating season. And it was magic, us in the middle of this place where there's rumored to be a jaguar and the last Mexican wolves north of the border. Okay. A few years later, Jim called from Michigan and asked me to meet him in Salt Lake City. He would field testing a new SUV for car and driver. Yeah, I know. The magazine wanted a Harrison story. I've never knew Jim to ever look under the hood of a vehicle in his life. So, they weren't talking about being a gearhead there. But anyway, we beat the hell out of this thing. I was quite impressed, actually, and saw some great country. We drove into the slick rock country of southeast Utah and climbed down into a canyon where we visited a panel of ancient petroglyphs carved in the rock. In the dark patina, a pair of cranes danced between a set of life-size wolf tracks, the Wolfman petroglyph outside a bluff. Here was a shaman's lair. Jim, with his bottomless curiosity, just sat there, taking it in. That's why I loved taking him to those places. He knew the moment. We didn't talk all the time. And he could be beautifully quiet. And later, we camped out on a precipitous finger of rock that jutted out in the Canyonlands National Park. It was one of Edward Abbey's two favorite camping sites, the other place being, the Cabeza Prieta place. And it fell off vertically for hundreds of feet in all directions. It's a finger north of Cathedral Rock that goes off towards Lavender Canyon and Salt Canyon. Jim's acrophobia kicked in when I lay my sleeping bag down next to the rim. He was not comfortable, The next morning, we returned to the valley floor, a necessary compromise. Jim Harrison was one of the most generous men I ever knew. He lent countless thousands to dozens of less fortunate friends who needed help. He seldom, if ever, got paid back, and that didn't stop him. Jim would invent jobs for me when he knew or thought I was broke. He lent money to my ex-wife that I never knew about. When traveling, he kept his single good eye out for a paucity of tip, the dangerous baldness of tires, or the looming mortgage payment. He took care of working writers like Chuck Bowden and Jack Turner. That generosity extended to sharing his time with younger and beginning writers who he encouraged and sometimes mentored throughout his life. At my wife's Andrea's bookstore, Elk River Books in Livingston, Montana, Jim was always up for signing books by the boxload. One night in 2001, when Jim was sicker than shit and Linda was in the hospital with a coma, he crawled up on a stage at a benefit and read with Peter Matheson, Living Montana's greatest literary night. Of course, I knew his books. My friend William Eastlake gave me a galley proof of Jim's first novel, Wolf, which Bill had blurred. Years later, Jim berated me for leaving that galley in a geodesic dome of a hippie college friend who lived deep in the woods of Ontario. Do you know how much that thing cost? Or, no, Jim said, do you know how much that thing is worth? There we go. After I read his first two novels, nothing he wrote surprised me, except perhaps the speed and ease with which he churned out Legends of the Fall. It was just a matter of time. When Jim began working on Dalva, he hired me to do research. You know, he paid me, and I wrote up my field notes from the months that I'd spent exploring the wild region of Baja's southern Gulf Coast, which Jim embedded verbatim in a novel. It's like 4 or 5 pages of Dalva. And Dalva remains my favorite book. Many decades later, our houses are by chance 10 miles apart in the same Montana valley. Sometimes I take my dog River over there to play with Harrison's dog Folly. The last time I went to his house was last fall, when his wife of 55 years, Linda King Harrison, died. In early February this year, Andrea and I picked up some white menudo at the Little Mexico restaurant in Tucson and made the drive to Patagonia, careful to pull into Jim's driveway at 3:30 sharp. A punctuality we always observed but never talked about. He was working as hard as I'd ever seen him, taking naps between bouts of writing. It's the only thing I know how to do, he kept saying. Jim was shirtless, still suffering from the lingering neuralgia of shingles, and his pants were falling off the crack of his ass. I want my wife back, but can't have her, he'd say. Jim still had his dog. A housekeeper would come over and feed him, and he still went to the Wagon Wheel Bar in the afternoon for drinks. But it was lonely out there. I can't emphasize that enough. He was really lonely those last months. The day they found Jim dead, our friend Phil Caputo was called over to say goodbye before the medics moved him. Jim was on the floor of his study where he's fallen from his chair, apparently from a heart attack, Phil wrote. He died a poet's death, Phil wrote that, literally, with a pen in his hand while writing a new poem. I smile as I remember the lightheaded macho shit I gave Harrison after he and Caputo got lost bird hunting east of the head of Sonoyta Creek and spent a freezing night huddled around the cottonwood fire until the Arizona Fish and Game Wardens came and found them the next morning. Doofless boys. Back home, I look out my window at the fresh snow blanketing the valley between the Absaroka Mountains and the foothills of the Galton Range, north towards Jim's place. There's a hole in the sky. Thank you. Let me tell one more story that kind of hooks up Abby with Jim a little bit. Oh, I'm talking about my friends. And I'll have more stories later if anybody wants to hear them. I've got a lot about Jim and Ed and I and Peter. God, I miss these guys. You know, when in Ed and Peter's case, they're about 15 years older than me, and you know, there's an edge of the patriarchy to a lot of male friendships. But at the end, I was there. I was there for Ed. You know, I was there the last days of his life. I was there alone with him the last night when he died. And I took him out and I buried him. And I just thought I'd just read this, which a story I told to Jim Harrison. This is about Ed. This is from, I think this is in the book Walking It Off. I'm not sure. The last time Ed Abbey smiled was when I told him where he was going to be buried. And I smile too when I think of this last small favor, this last simple task friends can do for one another. The rudimentary shovel work, this sweaty labor consummating trust, finally testing the exact confirmation by lying down in the freshly dug grave to check out the view. Bronze patina, a boulder beyond limb of Palo Verde, and turquoise sky beyond branch of Trowbridge, then receiving a sky. I had to lie down in the grave just to make sure it was all right, and it was. So I'm lying down in the grave, and 7 buzzards soaring above the grave, joined by 3 others, all 10 banking over the volcanic rubble and riding the thermal up the flank of the mountain, gliding out over the distant valley. Even years later, I grin as I crest the ridge above his grave. The earth falls away, and mountain ranges stretch off into the great distance as far as the eye can see. There is not a human sign or sound, only the faint desert breeze stirring the blossoms of brittlebush. We should be so lucky. On the eve of March 16th, I journeyed to the edge of this desert place. March 16th is a Day of the Dead for me. The anniversary of the My Lai massacre, and also the day in 1989, 3 friends and myself buried Ed Abbey here, illegally, of course, in accordance with his last wishes. I was ordered out of the field in Vietnam after the Tet Offensive, and it was March 16th. And the helicopter that picked me up, flew out to the coast, went north. We got shot at. No big deal. You get shot at all the time in helicopters. I looked down and I knew the place. It was My Lai. And of course, I didn't know till a year later when I saw those pictures in Life magazine what had gone down there. And that changed my life. You know, Doug Peacock was really shut of heaven because of that. And, you know, I was over there on Veterans Day in 2011. I was the only American, only person in My Lai. Those things happen, and you owe them for reasons you don't fully ever understand. Anyway, I had traveled out here alone to Ed's grave. And, you know, the need for ceremony comes into my life. Our culture doesn't provide a lot of ceremony. And, you know, and I maintain buffalo and circles of buffalo skulls in the wilderness of Yellowstone and bear skulls and cairns for my dad and, you know, and sites like the one I have for Ed Abbey's grave. I had traveled out here alone to Ed's grave, and you make up your ceremonies when your culture doesn't help you. We need them. You know, other cultures have healing ceremonies for warriors of return, you know, for shaman who have acquired death eyes by going beyond. Our culture is not very good at that. And I continue to make up my own. I had traveled out here alone to Ed's grave bearing little gifts, including a bottle of mezcal and a bowl of pozole verde I had made myself. I'm a good cook. I sat quietly on the black volcanic rocks, listening to the desert silence, pouring mezcal over the grave and down my throat until the moon came up, an hour or so before midnight. Suddenly, I heard a commotion to the south, the roar of basaltic scree thundering down the slope opposite me. A large, solitary animal was coming my way. I got the hell out of there. 2 days later, I told the story of my desert bighorn ram I heard but never saw to my poet friend, Jim Harrison. Well, Doug, Jim said, maybe it was old Dad. Thank you.